All right, y'all. Today we're going to be doing Unit 4, Day 3. Some reminders before we get started to make sure you have your history notebook out and you're taking notes as you move through this video. And make sure that you complete the vocabulary for this video by either highlighting it or writing down the definition as we go through the notes. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So our terms for today are going to be Indian National Congress, BG Tillak, the All India Muslim League, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Gandhi, Wahabis, Arab Mandates, and Salt March. Concepts, we're going to talk about India after World War I, the Middle East after World War I, and Africa after World War I. So this era is going to see a massive rise of nationalism in Africa and Asia. World War I is going to impact pretty much all of the European colonies because all of those colonies are going to be were required to fight for their colonial leaders. At the same time, Africa, Southeast Asia, Asia, India were all ignored at the Paris Peace Conference. While they fought in this Paris Peace in World War I, they will not be allowed to attend the Paris Peace Conference. So they will be just kind of brushed over. Now, if you remember back in last unit, near the end, we talked about the Indian National Congress in the 1880s. So again, due to this rise of nationalism after World War I, again, these kind of original kind of nationalism leaders are going to kind of resurge after World War I. Again, their primary function was to represent grievances to the British. Most of the issues concern the elite and not the poor. So it does become a bit of an issue. Now, that was the kind of peaceful option, but there are still militant nationalism. Militant meaning like, violence and boycotts, and nationalists such as BG Tillak is going to emphasize Hinduism. He's going to urge boycotts and more violence against the British to kind of push them out. But due to this militant nature and this kind of violence-oriented rebellion or kind of protest, this is going to frighten the moderates, which are like the middle class. This is going to frighten the Muslims and the Sikhs. And this is going to cause him to be exiled. Now, we also have a rise of a few other groups, such as the All India Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And he's gonna found the All India Muslim League in 1906 to represent Muslim interests, and they really want to create a kind of a separate state, kind of a two-state India, with northern India being Muslim and southern India being Hindu, and this will eventually lead to the partition of India and lead to Pakistan. Right? Now, the emergence of Gandhi and the nationalist struggle, Gandhi realized that India played a significant role in World War I, supplying troops, supplies, just general support to the British soldiers fighting in Europe and Britain as a whole. And wartime inflation caused significant reduction in the standard of living among Indian peasants. This will lead to famine because all of the food is leaving the country, going to Europe to feed the soldiers. Soldiers are leaving. Now, after the war, Britain promised a lot in the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919. They promised more self-government, less British control, and kind of more like independent India. And then the Rowlatt Act just said that no, you can't. That's not going to happen. And that act actually limited Indian civil rights. Due to these frustrations, this directly leads to the rise of Gandhi, and this permitted Gandhi to build a nationwide protest against British colonialism. Both the peasants and the middle class supported his leaderships, and due to this, and through his, boycotts, campaigns of civil resistance made him acceptable to both the radical, kind of violence-oriented groups and the moderates who are kind of on the fence. it allowed them, right? And also the All Muslim League supported Gandhi, and it was just kind of more acceptable to more people for his ways of boycott. Now, the most famous one is going to be the Salt March, known as the Dandi Saltigarda. Now, this is the big act of nonviolent civil disobedience. It's going to happen in the 1930s, and this is a campaign against the salt tax. The British Empire had a monopoly on the salt tax, um, and so if you were in India and wanted to buy salt, you had to buy it from the British, which then supported the British Empire, and doesn't that those funds don't go back into India. So Gandhi gets a group of his followers and walks 10 miles a day to the Indian Ocean where they can get salt. This leads to large scale civil disobedience, right? It's non-violent for the most part, but this is going to be like the biggest kind of march and kind of push for independence until after World War II. Let's talk about kind of independence and nationalism in other parts of the world. After World War One, the Ottoman Empire, of course, collapses, and we get a rise of Turkish nationalism, and this leads to the rise of the country of Turkey. Now, they abolished the caliphate and sultanate in 1922, and they created a republic. They also began the process of modernization in Turkish state culture. One of the biggest things is they're going to be the first Middle Eastern Muslim country to grant civil liberties and more rights to women in this time. And that they're going to be led by Ataturk, who's a Turkish war hero from World War One. Now, for Arabia, we have the rise of the Wahabists in Central Arabia. Prior to World War One, the Wahabists are puritanical Sunni religious fanatics, and they seek to cleanse Islam of all outside influences, and they really don't want Western interference. What they do is they ally with the Sunni family, and which was an extremely wealthy, influential family in Saudi Arabia, and they create Saudi Arabia, right? Get it? Saudi, family name, Arabia, Saudi Arabia. So that's what they do there, right? If you remember before World War One, the British, following the Muhaddist revolt, the British were kind of leery or kind of realizing that they can't control Egypt. And to forestall any more violent nationalist movements, they granted Egypt a new constitution, allowed parliamentary representation. But the Second World War One broke out. The British suspended their constitution, imposed martial law, cracked down, basically made it rough. And right after the war ended, they revolt. Martial law in Egypt during World War One imposed great hardships on the peasantry. They, again, the British didn't allow them to go to the Paris Peace Conference, and this just touched off a rebellion. And then between 1922 and 1936, the British basically withdraw from Egypt. They kind of let it go. They're like, okay, we can't hold on. They kind of let it go, but they kind of move back to only the Suez Canal. Now let's talk about Arab mandates. Now, this is directly from the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Triple Entente powers broke promises, broke basically every promise they made to the Arabs. Arabs were expected to become independent states upon the end of the war, but they were given mandates instead. The European powers believed that the Arabs could not control or not effectively run a government, so what they were basically put under mandates. And these mandates were controlled by the French and British. And what they were supposed to do was they would be a mandate for a time. They would get the government and the economy up and running, and they'd be left on their own, kind of prepared for independence. The French did not do that. The French basically robbed the entire area of natural resources, goods, and things, and then bailed. The British tried. They didn't do very well. Um, this leads to Arab resistance, specifically in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Um, in Iraq, the British eventually put the Hashemite king on the Iraqi throne and then just let them run the thing. Like, you're good, whatever. Now, biggest hot button issue for the time is going to be Palestine, the Palestinians, and the Jewish home state of due to the Balfour Declaration. Now, Zionists were Jews seeking to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but the thing is, the British also promised the Palestinians an area to live, but they also promised the Jewish populations there to live. And for the time, they're just like, we're not dealing with it, and they just stopped dealing with it until after World War II. Now, lastly, we're going to talk about Africa. Now, this is just a touch. We're going to talk about Africa more later. But during World War One, most educated African elites are going to remain loyal to the colonial regimes, just because they were promised, you know, educational reform, economic reform, political reform, kind of more independence. After the war, the British broke all those promises, right? What does this lead to? This leads to civil disobedience, strikes, independence movements, rise in nationalism, um, and the first nationalist movements are going to appear in Africa in the 1920s, and they're really going to follow a lot of the same ideals as Gandhi. There will be violent revolutions, but most of them will be nonviolent civil disobedience. So that's all I have for you today. Make sure that you were taking notes as you move through the video. Make sure you're knocking out the vocabulary, and I'll see you guys in class.